The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, the maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 6 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS America product lineup includes three-phase string inverters ranging from 25 to 275 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 250-275, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. The 250-275 pairs well with CPS America's exceptional data communication, controls, and energy storage solutions. Go to chintpowersystems.com to find out more.
Certainly, hydrogen is a tool in the toolkit. It's not the Swiss Army knife that everyone thinks, solving all the problems, but it does have a place. And I think in the next few years, we'll get a much clearer sense as to what's real, what's the hope and what's the hype. And hopefully, like I said, hopefully we fail fast and discard the stuff that's not going to work.
Are you speeding the energy transition? Here at the Clean Power Hour, our hosts Tim Montague and John Weaver bring you the best in solar, batteries, and clean technologies every week. Want to go deeper into decarbonization? We do too. We're here to help you understand and command the commercial, residential, and utility solar, wind, and storage industries. So let's get to it. Together we can speed the energy transition.
Today on the Clean Power Hour, the promises and perils of hydrogen. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Welcome to the Clean Power Hour. Check out all of our content at cleanpowerhour.com. Give us a rating and a review on Apple and Spotify, and please reach out to me. I love hearing from my listeners. Check out my YouTube channel and connect with me on LinkedIn. Today, we're going to be geeking out on the hydrogen economy. My guest today is Peter Kelly-Detwiler, otherwise known as PKD. He is the author of The Energy Switch, fantastic book. If you haven't read that book, check it out. And he is a well-known industry consultant in the utility space, and he's very interested in the energy transition, and he is a well-known consultant and trainer in the energy transition. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Tim.
It is your second time being on the show. I want to make sure our listeners understand that. In the first episode we did a couple years ago, we were focused on The Energy Switch, your book. Today we are going to go deep into hydrogen. And as our listeners know, hydrogen is a fantastic element. It is the most common element in the universe, if I recall correctly. The sun is made mostly of hydrogen. And so we have this thing called a fusion reactor in the sky that is raining photons down on us. And so you see immediately there, just in the life of Earth, how important hydrogen is to our solar system, our Earth, and to the universe at large. And when you grok how abundant those photons are, you realize that, wow, we're a water planet. We have lots of water. And when you take photons and turn them into electrons, then you can create green hydrogen with green photons with this process called electrolysis. So there is a tremendous opportunity for green hydrogen. But we already have a hydrogen economy. It's based on the fossil fuel industry. And so why don't you set the table for us, Peter? What is the existing hydrogen economy? And in a few short words, like, what is the next 5, 10, 20 years look like for you? And then we'll go deeper into some of these segments.
Sure. So the existing hydrogen economy is largely centered around two industrial processes in this country. One is hydrogen is used in large quantities in refining. And the other one is it's in the fertilizer industry, because ammonia, NH3, 1 nitrogen, 3 hydrogen, is the precursor to ammonia, which goes into nitrates making fertilizer. So we've been doing that in this country for decades. In fact, there's a very well-developed hydrogen economy down the Gulf Coast and from Texas across to Louisiana, and over 1,000 miles of hydrogen dedicated pipelines down there. So we've been doing that for a long time. What we're now trying to do, though, is to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors of our global energy economy. Yes, maybe hydrogen in transportation. I think not, and we can talk about that later and why.
Yeah.
But certainly areas, for example, like high heat that you need for industrial processes. Hydrogen could be a suitable replacement for coke/coal or natural gas there. And then in the steel industry, which is responsible for about 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Today, what do? We take iron ore and we smelt it with huge amounts of heat, driving out the impurities, including water and oxygen, excuse me. And what you do with direct reduction is you actually infuse hydrogen into this ore, and it goes off in the form of steam, taking out those impurities, and then you can throw it into an electric arc furnace and thereby decarbonize the hydrogen industry. So there's lots of potential to use this simple molecule for decarbonizing the economy. The real devil's in the details and in the costs and the fact that it is a simple molecule with its own unique behavioral characteristics.
Yeah. So what are the major, let's quickly review the major industries. You mentioned industrial heat and steelmaking. There's the possibility of using hydrogen in transportation. That is still very nascent and holds promise mostly for long haul, like trucks and trains and ships and planes, perhaps. But what are the major segments? You mentioned fertilizer. Does green hydrogen play into all of those spaces?
Well, potentially hydrogen, irrespective of how it's made, could play into all those spaces. The real question is, where are you eliminating carbon from the economy at the lowest cost? Ultimately, this doesn't, you see a lot of discussion around, well, we could create and use this much hydrogen. But then the question really is, well, it's the carbon, stupid. And so you hear conversations around, well, with the hydrogen hubs, for example, and with the tax credits, well, let's use the grid 24/7 with electrolyzers. If we were to do that, we might have solar in the daytime and then all kinds of grid power at night. We could result in a perverse outcome with more greenhouse gas emissions than less if we do this the wrong way. It's really complex. And so, when you first look at it, it's sort of this wonder drug. You run it through a fuel cell or you run it through a combustion turbine and you get water, right? Beautiful. Right. What could be wrong with that? It's really all the nuances and the costs. And then how does this really ultimately impact the decarbonization strategies that we're trying to employ globally at what cost? That's where it gets really tricky. And, one person in this industry who's really figured this out, to my mind, in a great way, is Michael Liebreich. He founded Bloomberg New Energy Finance, was way ahead of the curve on batteries, solar, a lot of other energy conversion technologies. And now he has this thing called the hydrogen ladder. And what he does, and I find it a useful way of looking at this, is think about all the different sectors of the economy we're trying to decarbonize, and where are there alternatives to hydrogen and where are there not? And therefore, so for example, let's take one simple case. Transportation, a passenger vehicle. Originally, people think, oh, great, let's get more Toyota Mirais out there and other hydrogen-powered fuel cell vehicles. Well, if you take green hydrogen, let's say you take 100 kilowatt hours of green electricity and put it through an electrolyzer and then compress that hydrogen and then store it someplace and then run it through a fuel cell, which ultimately feeds an electric motor like an electric car. By the time you get through the whole process, you've lost 2/3 of that raw green energy.
Right.
So why not take that electricity and put it into a lithium-ion battery where you're going to have 90% round-trip efficiency and only lose about 10% in the battery technology, and another 5% or so getting energy to the wheels. So really, again, it's all about what end uses are we trying to focus on and where are there alternatives that are more cost-effective. And ultimately, we only have so much capital in the world to decarbonize this economy. Being smart about what we're using for what end uses is the name of the game. And his ladder is a really good explanation of the priorities and how we should think about that.
Yeah, and if you just Google hydrogen ladder, you'll find it on LinkedIn, hydrogen ladder version 5.0. So thank you for referencing that. We'll put a link in the show notes, of course. It boggles the mind sometimes, Peter, what things we do. There's this vehicle called the Mirai, for example, right? The Toyota, it's a passenger vehicle in California only, as far as I know. And when you buy a Mirai, it's like a $50,000 car. So it's a premium vehicle. but it comes with some incentive, like you get free hydrogen fueling for a couple of years when you buy a Mirai. And there is, a small network of fueling stations in a few markets in California, in LA, and in San Francisco. But as you pointed out, like the first energetic principles of that are really not very good. And I always say, well, why isn't Elon Musk going after hydrogen for consumer vehicles if there's a there? And I don't think that there is a there. I think there is perhaps a there for larger vehicles, for trucks or trains, and you see this on the latter. But I guess how do you help my audience of energy professionals who are very interested in the energy transition? They're very deep into solar, wind, and energy storage, and hydrogen is a form of storage. Okay, it can be used like a battery, but the round trip efficiency of that is problematic. So how do you, let's continue to paint this picture, because I think it is still hard for people to kind of grab onto. It seems rather nebulous, unless you already work in, say, the fertilizer industry where hydrogen is a common thing. If you work in transportation, we're all of us energy professionals are becoming more and more versed about electrification of transportation. For example, if you're a solar installer, tomorrow you're a solar and EV charger and infrastructure installer, right? You can't rely on that single basket of I put solar panels on rooftops anymore, I don't think. I think that business model is fading away. So, transportation is very important to my audience, but how paint a picture of how to get our arms around this.
Sure, and admittedly, it is complex. So, and you're right, it is, for the most part, hydrogen is a carrier. If you think about it, is a chemical battery, not an electrochemical battery, but chemical in that sense, right? And so let's look at decarbonization of the grid for one moment. Right now, we've got, say, 30% renewables in various grids, and we haven't had to add a lot of storage yet, because you can essentially flex the gas generators, make them work harder, and deal with the variability. Then you start to get 40, 50, 60% renewables. Now you need some kind of medium to long range storage, longer duration storage. So you start to look at flow batteries that get you 8, 10, 12 hours, some gravity assisted batteries, certainly some more pumped hydro, although those are really expensive. And then you've got batteries like the reverse rust iron air battery from Form Energy that gets you, say, 40% round trip efficiency. Still better than hydrogen, which is 30 to 35%. Now, but the Form gets you 100 hours. Okay, so now you get to, maybe with those technologies, maybe you could decarbonize 70% of your grid. Well, what about those days when you have seasonal, what the Germans call Dunkelflaute, where the sun's lower in the sky, and then maybe you have a front that comes through, installs the wind turbines, and suddenly you don't have the energy you need. Now what do? Well, the thinking is maybe in the future we do what they're already working on in Utah, which is build these massive caverns in salt domes, hauling them out with water, and store gigawatt hours of electricity in the form of hydrogen. And then run that through turbines, which now advanced turbines can burn at about a 50 or 60% mix with methane. They can't do 100%. The simple frame turbines can, but the more complex ones like the H classes cannot. So that's like one area where you look at hydrogen and think, okay, there's some potential long-term use there as you get further and further out, because it costs about $200 a megawatt hour to generate with hydrogen because of all those inefficiencies. Then you look at other sectors like long-haul trucking. You mentioned that one. One of the things I'm always cautioning people on in the conversations is you can't look at anything separate from everything else. And it's really dangerous to take a snapshot view. So first, let's look at hydrogen itself. How do we get the cost down? Well, first thing you want to do is get the cost of renewables as low as you possibly can. And where you can, when you have longer duration renewables, so for example, wind at night, solar in the daytime, that's helpful. Why? Because your electrolyzers are expensive. And so the more you can use them, the higher capacity utilization factor you have, the
Right.
more you can lower your cost of H2. So that's a piece of the equation. Then you got to drive down the cost of the electrolyzers themselves. And there's there's four technologies, but two major ones, which are alkaline, which are low cost, but they don't follow the variability of renewables the same way PEMs do, which are higher cost, but they use materials like platinum, so they're more expensive. And part of the challenge with electrolyzers is making them more efficient, just converting the energy into water, taking the water, turning it into hydrogen. By the way, you use up to 30 kilograms of water for the cooling of the electrolyzers, everything else, and just also for the raw chemical formula of separating the H2 into the O2 in the hydrogen. So you got to think about those issues.
Right.
And ultimately, then you want to do what we've done with batteries and solar panels, which is the experience curve, driving down the costs and hoping that with every global doubling of cumulative output, the cost can fall by 20 or 25%. So there's this huge bet on the come that we can follow the same sorts of curves that we've done with solar and batteries. And that's one of the reasons you see so much money being thrown at this from the Europeans and the US, is maybe by just throwing billions of dollars at this, tens of billions of dollars at it, we can jumpstart this thing and scale it and get it to, at some point in the future, where it will be cost effective because it is by no means cost effective now. A kilogram of gray hydrogen made from steam methane reformation, taking natural gas, CH4, and separating out the carbon and the hydrogen, that costs you like $1 right now per kilogram. Green H2 is somewhere in the $5 to $8 range by most estimates. So it has to come way down in order to become cost effective.
Yeah. So let's reiterate this. You mentioned first and foremost bringing down the cost of renewables. That is absolutely an essential thing for the energy transition writ large. And my previous guest, Matt Campbell at Terabase and Jim Tyler at Earthos, are beating this drum very hard, trying to figure out ways to reduce the cost of large-scale solar, for example, down to about a penny a kWh is what they consider to be the tipping point. That's $1 a megawatt hour. And, some very large PPAs, solar PPAs, have been done around the world in the 1 to 2 cent range. And, as panel prices come down, and they are coming down, eventually we will get there. And, eventually when you fast forward 30 years, the grid is going to be about 50% solar, 40% wind, and the rest is hydro and nuclear. And so we will make that transition, right? It's a question of how decarbonized it will be. And then there's also this question, which I encourage my listeners to also think about, is how do we get back to 300 ppm? And hydrogen doesn't necessarily solve that problem whatsoever. It's just it's a tool for the energy transition, for decarbonizing the economy and decarbonizing aspects of heavy industry, steel making, food processing, and then transportation and other forms of manufacturing. So it's a wonderful thing. We want green hydrogen. We have to be careful, as you said, because we could invest money in the wrong ways. And talk about money, okay, the Inflation Reduction Act is incentivizing green hydrogen, I think with a couple of dollars. Is it $3 per kilogram?
$3. Yeah.
Yeah. So
low carbon intensity.
So it's trying to create parity between what you call status quo, brown, gray hydrogen from hydrocarbons at $1, and then current market is say $5 if we're lucky. Okay, you're getting closer with that $3 incentive. Is that truly working? I know that the DOE announced a network of hydrogen hubs last year. Tell us about that.
Yeah, they put $7 billion into ultimately 7 different hydrogen hubs, some which will be using blue hydrogen, which is steam methane reformation with carbon capture and storage, some using pink, which is nuclear power, and then some using green. And by the way, there are some other colors. White is hydrogen that comes from industrial processes as a byproduct. We use a lot of white right now in this country. About 20% of the hydrogen in this country is white. So it's essentially free. And then there's this other thing you might have been hearing recently, gold hydrogen or naturally occurring hydrogen, which there's hydrogen that seeps out of the earth all over the world. And there are companies like Coloma, I think they just raised almost $250 million. And they're drilling for naturally occurring hydrogen here in the United States. And then ARPA-E actually just gave out about $20 million to companies to help to stimulate naturally occurring hydrogen. It occurs in iron-rich rock. They think it happens, well, they know it happens when water comes into contact with that rock. And this thing called serpentinization occurs that releases hydrogen. And they're thinking, well, maybe if we inject water in, we can accelerate that process. So there's some other, funky little things going on in this space as well. But back to the hubs. So there's basically these 7 hubs. They're regional hubs. They're meant to do all these different things and accelerate the process. But none of them, while they mostly got just a little bit under or over $1 billion each, they're meant to catalyze a lot of industry from the other stakeholders. And what they've got to do now is they've got to submit more technically detailed papers in terms of who the players are and what they're actually going to do. And then there's a bunch of stage gates they have to jump through to eventually access all the financing. And the thinking is most of these won't get built until closer to the end of the decade, because there's a lot of pieces that you have to pull together. Each one of them involves production, middle infrastructure, getting the hydrogen from the production to the end users, and then a community of different end users. So it can be transportation, can be industry, can be fertilizer, can be methanol, for example. One of the other things hydrogen is finding its way into is not just pure H2, but also into derivatives like turbines that can burn ammonia or methanol. Sustainable aviation fuels can be based on hydrogen with carbon captured from the stack, etc. So it is a really cool little molecule that can be used for a lot of other compounds.
It's a cool but devilish molecule, right? Because it's very small and light. It wants to escape. It wants to float, and it gets its way into other elements. So let's talk a little bit more about that. For example, you can take existing pipelines that move methane and retrofit them to move hydrogen, but you can't use them in their existing form. You have to reformat those pipelines and treat them in other ways, because hydrogen will make traditional metal pipelines brittle and ultimately break. And so it's not a no-brainer to convert a methane economy, so to speak, to a hydrogen economy in terms of our ability. I mean, when you look at the methane network, the natural gas network around the United States, it is a grid of its own, right? Those pipelines are everywhere. Tens, hundreds of thousands of miles of those natural gas pipelines. And you just don't see them because they're mostly underground. But they're there, trust me. and of course, we've run this pipeline to our end user, to consumers in many, many places. Now we're starting to step that back. But tell us more about the challenges and opportunities in terms of getting hydrogen around. It's totally doable to make it, but can we package it and transport it around to use it the places we need to use it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for short distances, you use tube trucks. They're basically trucks with multiple tubes on the back, and companies like Plug Power and others are already moving hydrogen in these tube trucks. And then, for longer distances, middle distances, you use pipelines, and then for really long distance overseas, you use ships. But you won't put it in a ship in the form of pure hydrogen, because liquefying it's super expensive, and you have this thing called boil off where it warms up a little bit because you have to keep it at really cold temperatures. And so you have to vent it, and you lose hydrogen in the process of shipping it.
Okay.
So much more stable to ship it in the form of ammonia and or methanol, CH3OH. With the pipeline itself, sort of those middle distances, the challenge, as you alluded to, is first of all, that little H2 molecule is way simpler than the CH4 molecule, so it wants to get out everywhere. So you have to essentially redo all your valves. And one thing about hydrogen a lot of people do not appreciate, it is not a global warming gas per se, but when it wanders up into the atmosphere, it has this unfortunate tendency to slow down the degradation of methane. And methane in its first 20 years or so is 80 times more effective at trapping the radiative heat as CO2 is. So unfortunately, hydrogen is an indirect greenhouse gas, and the first studies have come out of the UK in the last year, and now there's some other evidence so that it could be actually another significant global warming gas if a lot of it leaks out and we're not careful. Then, as you mentioned as well, because of the way it behaves as a molecule and an atom, it likes to infiltrate into steel pipelines, especially steel pipelines that have been used in the gas network and subjected to multiple pressures over time. You know, we pack our pipelines with gas sometimes to store amounts of gas before heavy periods of usage. The gas pipelines down in the Gulf Coast that we use for pure hydrogen, they pigged them recently, tested them under pressure. They've been around for decades. They're fine. But you can't take an existing natural gas pipeline and do what you did or do with those hydrogen pipelines dedicated to H2, because a lot of them are older and they do have some molecular deformations in them. And then the molecules, the hydrogen molecules, like to get in there, and then they cause the embrittlement of the steel. So right now, places like California limit the amount of hydrogen that can be blended up to 5% and no more. You actually can put, Tim, 5% H2 into the pipeline and with a membrane pull it out someplace else. So you actually can move it through a pipeline right now in small amounts that are blended. Europe's actually trying to repurpose a whole lot of existing pipelines, but there are going to be cost challenges and then certainly safety challenges. And nobody really knows right now what the upper limit should be. And part of the reason why is because all the pipelines are of different ages and have been subjected to different operating regimes. So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting challenge to retrofit pipelines if we go beyond some kind of a blending approach, which is what we're looking at now.
The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, the maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 6 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS America product lineup includes three-phase string inverters ranging from 25 to 275 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 250-275, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. The 250-275 pairs well with CPS America's exceptional data communication, controls, and energy storage solutions. Go to chintpowersystems.com to find out more. You know, a big part of the energy transition here in the United States, Peter, is that we're converting coal power plants to natural gas power plants, which have lower emissions than coal. And then we're converting, so we're shutting down coal, we're ramping natural gas slightly still, and eventually we're transitioning away from natural gas power plants now, converting them to solar, wind, and batteries. But there's a project called ACES, which you can Google, which is a hybrid where they're generating, the idea is to generate and store hydrogen and then burn it in thermal generators, turbines that today burn natural gas, and then they will blend in hydrogen, and then maybe you can tell us about this, convert to pure hydrogen. Is there such thing as a pure hydrogen thermal power plant in the future?
Yeah, so what they're planning to do is starting in 2025, when that gets commissioned, it's an 840 megawatt facility, burn a 30% blend, and then ultimately by 2045, which is when California has its 100% green grid legislation, burn 100%. And it's dedicated to Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Now, actually, when I was writing the book, I had a chance to talk to the GE turbine specialists a couple of years ago in Schenectady. And what they explained is there are a couple critical challenges here. First of all, we talked before about the lack of density of hydrogen. It holds about, by volume, a third the amount of energy as methane does. So you got to move 3 times through the same space, pipeline or turbine, to generate the same amount of electricity. That creates its own physical challenges. Then it burns hotter than natural gas, which means you have more nitrous oxide formation, and nitrous oxides are damaging to kids' lungs, and they also are the precursor to smog. So you got some issues there. Then you also have the fact that there's this thing called flame speed. And so, in the movies, when you see the bad guy in the car, and the gas is dripping out, and you see this source of ignition, you're like, oh yeah, this guy's going to get it. And then you see basically the flame travel up the gas and explode the car with the bad guy in it.
Yeah.
That's flame speed. So flame speed in hydrogen is faster than flame speed in methane, in CH4. And what that means is that the combustion takes place in a different part of the turbine. So the turbine itself actually has to be designed somewhat differently than your typical gas turbine. And so there are a couple of challenges that have made it possible. So with the more rugged frame turbines that Siemens and Mitsubishi and GE have had out there for a long time, they can burn and have been burning 100% hydrogen in different applications. But for the turbines that are more efficient, that are basically the ones that are being moved into the marketplace now, they're at, if you look at GE's most recent numbers on this, they're at about a 60% blend. Now, they, and especially Mitsubishi, are already selling hydrogen compatible turbines to those levels to companies like Entergy and the ACES project and some other places around the country, with the thinking that, okay, soon we'll see some kind of a blend, but the cost is still prohibitive. Last year, Constellation proved in a plant in the south, either Mississippi, Alabama, I think it was Mississippi, Hillabee plant, they burned a 28% mix in an existing turbine to prove they could do that. New York Power Authority also burned a mix within the last couple of years. And then in Ohio, there's a facility in Hannibal that's been consistently mixing 5% H2 into methane and burning that now for a long time. And they wanted to prove that they could consistently mix. So there's some steps being taken to move towards hydrogen compatible turbines. But again, you're going to get into this issue of where's the hydrogen coming from? How cost effectively can you produce it? And then how do you deal with those efficiency losses from the production to the handling of it, the shipping, and ultimately, storage, and then running it through the turbine? That's going to get you those miserable round trip efficiencies.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the map of the ACES project. I mean, the geographies covered here are stunning. It's a huge geography. There's elements of the project in Utah, Nevada, and California, California being the end user of the electricity. But where are they going to get all this water, for example,
Good question.
in Utah?
Yep, I was just about to raise that. Yes, where are you going to get the water? And that is a constraining factor in a lot of places. In fact, so the areas where you do see these massive projects going forward, look at the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia, 4,000 megawatts of renewables feeding electrolyzers on the Red Sea. They're going to desalinate that water.
Okay.
Same thing in Oman. It's all going to be ocean-based water that they take the salt out of.
Using solar thermal, or how are they desalinizing?
They'll probably, I'm not even sure what the tech is for that, whether it's solar energy that they're, but the membranes in the electrolyzers need to have pure water. Any impurities gunk up those membranes. So that's another critical piece of this thing. But yes, water is sort of the dirty little secret and a constraint that hasn't yet adequately been addressed. Some folks say, well, if you shut down a coal plant, all that cooling water could be used. But you still got to look at what are the quantities in it. And as I mentioned before, the cooling of the electrolyzers is actually a very considerable part of the water equation.
So the electrolyzer gets hot?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, we have a little pilot project here in Champaign, Illinois, where I live, Champaign-Urbana. It's a mass transit district project where we have a Nel electrolyzer. Nel is a Norwegian electrolyzer company. I believe that's a PEM electrolyzer. Is that right?
Probably, yeah, I think it is, yeah. The Chinese are pretty much the alkaline folks, and then the Europeans and the US are the PEMs.
Okay. And so then they have a solar array on some leased land across the street. It's like a 2 megawatt solar array generating electricity that they then are making local hydrogen, and then they have a small fleet of hydrogen buses. Now, the only thing that I've heard, unfortunately, I haven't been able to interview the MTD on this, but I've heard through the grapevine that the buses were not charging very well, meaning it was hard to get enough hydrogen into the bus to make it run long enough to make it economical. So anyway, good pilot project, exciting that little things like this are happening. But as you know, I think my listeners are aware, we need to do this on a massive, massive scale. And that delta, $1 current, gray hydrogen to $5 of green is a big delta. That's a 5x delta, and money talks, man. The reason we haven't made the energy transition yet is because it's cheaper to not make the energy transition yet. We will eventually make the energy transition, and economics are getting there on our side. And it's an important role that the government plays in seeding that and incentivizing that, because the government incentivizes all forms of energy and transportation. The fossil fuel industry is heavily subsidized globally. I think the global subsidies for fossil fuels are something like $6 trillion, Peter. You would know this.
Yeah, I saw a number. It depends upon whether or not you assume their right to basically treat the atmosphere as an open sewer is considered as one of the subsidies or not.
And that is borrowing from future generations, basically, right? We're borrowing from the livelihoods, the economic well-being, and the health and safety of future generations. It's very strange how, when you look at the hierarchy of priorities that the current generation has, down at the bottom of the list of those priorities is the well-being of future generations. We're not very good at making that a top priority.
That's what an economic discount rate is all about, is saying, I do not value my future or anybody else's as much as I value today.
Yes, indeed. That is a conundrum that humanity absolutely is going to have to solve if we're going to get to the next 500 years or so. We're experiencing a bottleneck, and it's starting to show up, right? Climate change is starting to show up. The weather is weirding, and people are migrating. Food systems are being disrupted. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg, honestly, even though we have had major disruptions in some places, and we see the rise in temperature, in sea level, in the frequency of storms, fires, droughts, etc. It is happening. But it's going to get a lot worse. And maybe you and I will be in the ground by that time. But, we're very concerned for future generations. So what else should we talk about, Peter? I really appreciate this conversation, but what else should our listeners know that they may not know about the hydrogen economy?
I think they should know that we are very much in the early stages. I like to say about some incipient technologies that, if this were a baseball game, we'd still be hauling the batting cages onto the field. What my biggest concern is, there is a large segment of the world that doesn't wish the clean energy transition well, and is pretty entrenched and always looking for the failure story, the EV that caught fire in the garage in Montreal,
right,
or one thing. And they usually point to one failure to say, see, like Solyndra, classic example, right? The $500+ million loan that went bad, even though the whole program made money for the American taxpayer. And my biggest concern with all these subsidies with hydrogen, where it's already clear there are some end uses that shouldn't be considered and others that probably should, and we should always have carbon in our minds, that we're going to end up doing some things where we can look back and say, well, that was really dumb. And it gives ammunition to those who don't wish the transition well. And it also, makes your average person wonder, well, is this a really good thing? And so the peril for me of hydrogen is a perceptional peril, because there's plenty of ways to spend billions of dollars and put them in the wrong places. And what we need to do here is fail fast, as quickly as possible, recognize, this thing doesn't work, even if there's inertia behind it, and pull the money from that and reallocate it to other places. And I fear that we're already building up a lot of inertia in this space because there's so much money at stake and large companies involved. And, classic example right now are those tax credits, where right now you can say, I'm going to offset all of my hydrogen production with solar, but you're going to run the electrolyzers all day long. And so you're going to be feeding them with grid power, and therefore you actually could have a situation where the hydrogen is worse in terms of carbon intensity than blue hydrogen. And those are the sorts of things that really cause me agita around this issue.
Yes. Yeah, we don't want to make the problem worse. We already have a massive problem. Remember, listener, ppm in the atmosphere of CO2 is 420 and climbing at about 1% a year. Okay, we have not turned the corner yet. We're starting to slow down a little bit, and basically, even though solar was more than 50% of new power on the grid in the United States last year, okay, that's a good signal. We're just replacing the addition to the grid. We're growing the grid. We're going to triple the grid when we electrify transportation, right? Because it takes a lot of electricity to power batteries to drive vehicles. And we are going to do that, and the economics of that will be on our side in a few years. We're still not quite there yet. There's a lot of FUD in the market, as you put your finger on, and that's not actually credible FUD. There's a lot of casting of shade on the electrification of transportation, and the vested interests are very powerful. The fossil lobby is very, very powerful. And government has been captured by capitalism, basically. Our democracy is highly flawed. It is the best thing that we seem to have been able to invent as a system of governance in the world. It's very good at accumulating wealth and power, but it is flawed. And so we had to be very careful. That's all I can say. Like, the challenges are still many. Anything else you want to say about the hydrogen economy, or any other resources you want to point our listeners to?
Other resource, the DOE has the hydrogen liftoff report, and so it's worth looking at some of the U.S. government documents just to get a sense of what they're thinking about this and what is driving where they're putting their money. I think also one other thing that will be interesting to watch is right now those hubs, they don't have a lot of documentation out in the public yet. It's pretty scant at this moment. But they will start to, because they're accessing public money, we're going to start to see more definition of what they're actually trying to accomplish. I think that's going to be really interesting for those of us in this space who are trying to figure out, well, what's really going to happen here, and is this going to catalyze the right investments, and is it going to lead us to the cleaner energy future that we want? Certainly, hydrogen is a tool in the toolkit. It's not the Swiss Army knife that everyone thinks, solving all the problems, but it does have a place. And I think in the next few years, we'll get a much clearer sense as to what's real, what's the hope and what's the hype. And hopefully, like I said, hopefully we fail fast and discard the stuff that's not going to work.
I hope we've whetted your appetite. I appreciate everyone being here and giving us your time today. If you go to RE Plus events around the country, you should know that you can run into PKD there. He does give workshops. That's how I knew PKD was doing workshops on hydrogen. I took one at RE Plus Northeast. So reach out to Peter. Check out all of the events at our events page. There are links to some of the regional RE Plus events. cleanpowerhour.com. Go to the events tab. And please give us a rating and a review on our content on Apple and Spotify. Those are the two best ways you can support the show. And tell a friend about the show. Of course, word of mouth is, bar none, the best way to help spread the show. Peter, how can our listeners find you?
The best way is peterkelly.detwiler.com. And of course, on LinkedIn, I think there's only one of me in the world, which is why I stopped committing crime a long time ago. And it's just Peter, and then KELLY-DETWILER. Oh, I also have a reading list of 42 things I read every day, including hydrogen newsletters and so on. Happy to share that with anybody who wants to know where all this raw material comes from.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, Peter Kelly-Detwiler, author of The Energy Switch and global expert on the energy transition. Thank you so much. And thank you, listener, for being here. I'm Tim Montague. Let's grow solar and storage. Hey, listeners. This is Tim. I want to give a shout out to all of you. I do this for you twice a week. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us your time. I really appreciate you and what you're all about. You are part and parcel of the energy transition, whether you're an energy professional today or an aspiring energy professional. So thank you. I want to let you know that the Clean Power Hour has launched a listener survey, and it would mean so much to me if you would go to cleanpowerhour.com, click on the About Us link right there on the main navigation. That takes you to the About page, and you'll see a big graphic, Listener Survey. Just click on that graphic, and it takes just a couple of minutes. If you fill out the survey, I will send you a lovely baseball cap with our logo on it. The other thing I want our listeners to know is that this podcast is made possible by corporate sponsors. We have Chin Power Systems, the leading three-phase string inverter manufacturer in North America. So check out CPS America. But we are very actively looking for additional support to make this show work. And you see here our media kit with all the sponsor benefits and statistics about the show. You know, we're dropping 2 episodes a week. We have now over 320,000 downloads on YouTube, and we're getting about 45,000 downloads per month. So this is a great way to bring your brand to our listeners, and our listeners are decision makers in clean energy. This includes project executives, engineers, finance, project management, and many other professionals who are making decisions about and developing, designing, installing, and making possible clean energy projects. So check out cleanpowerhour.com, both our listener survey on the About Us and our media kit, and become a sponsor today. Thank you so much. Let's grow solar and storage. The Clean Power Hour is brought to you by CPS America, the maker of North America's #1 three-phase string inverter, with over 6 gigawatts shipped in the U.S. The CPS America product lineup includes three-phase string inverters ranging from 25 to 275 kW. Their flagship inverter, the CPS 250-275, is designed to work with solar plants ranging from 2 megawatts to 2 gigawatts. The 250-275 pairs well with CPS America's exceptional data communication, controls, and energy storage solutions. Go to chinpowersystems.com to find out more.